Today, I will be discussing Canada's decrease in funding for international development and involvement in peacekeeping missions over the past 15 years. Many Canadians consider Canada to be a peacekeeping nation. However, due to choices that our government has made in recent years, we have shifted from being a peacekeeping nation to a pro-military nation. Peacekeeping is part of the Canadian history and identity, and we are known for our soft power reputation. At the start of the Harper government in 2006, there has been a number of African countries that have been cut from the Canadian development efforts, partners have been defunded, and there's been a decline in peacekeeping, which has shifted to military support. There is a relationship between peacekeeping and international development. Peacekeeping provides a stable environment that allows for international development projects to become more effective and sustainable. With Canada decreasing our efforts in both, there is much more that we can do to fulfill our global responsibility. Canada's image for peacekeeping started in 1956 by Lester Pearson. From 1956 to the mid-1990s, Canada was the largest contributor of peacekeepers and was the only country to be involved with every UN mission. 70% of Canadians find that military peacekeeping is a defining characteristic of our nation. However, we have turned down so many UN requests for troops, that they no longer ask us. Because of these choices, we are now 51st in peacekeeping nations. To put this into perspective, in 1991, 10% of all UN troops were Canadian. As of 2007, only 0.1% of troops are now Canadian. Since then, we have lost our seat in the UN Security Council because we were only investing resources in nations that would help enhance our own economy. One example that might be the reason for why Canada has shifted from being a peacekeeping nation to a pro-military nation is due to an anti-UN bias experienced by many senior officers in our army. This bias is thought to may have been created due to past experiences with the UN and because of top-grade logistics and tactical support that the US military can provide. A Canadian academic had a conversation with a senior officer, and he had said it was unlikely that there would be any more Canadian military involved with UN missions. An example that shows Canada's decrease in peacekeeping was the closure of the Pearson Peacekeeping Centre at the beginning of 2014. The centre was created in order to show Canada's commitment to UN peacekeeping and provided world-class training for Canadians and other citizens around the world. It received a cut in government funding, which decreased its capacity. Then, the number of activities that they could hold decreased, and eventually they were no longer able to have any peacekeeping missions. They tried to reach out for funding from other venues, however, they were not able to fulfill the gap from the government funding it once had. Due to this, it was forced to close. During the time that Canada was involved with the war in Afghanistan, there was more deaths than 60 years of peacekeeping missions. More money had been spent during this time than Canada as an entirety of a peacekeeping nation. A quote from the novel At Home in the World by Jennifer Welsh says that, "In my vision, model citizens pull their weight. But for Canada to do so, we need to re-examine why we have a military and what we want to use it for." This follows well with an Army officer's comment saying that as the soldiers have returned from Afghanistan, the military combined with the Canadian interest to become once again a peacekeeping nation. However, if Canada is going to return to being a peacekeeping nation, it would involve a lot of effort from the government. Over the past years, Canada's involvement with international development has also decreased. When interviewed, many people in power in other countries around the world can only name international development activities that Canada was involved with during the time that Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister. The reason why they could name these activities were due to him actively pursuing Canadian interests in bilateral negotiations. He was able to develop positive relationships with other countries, and he invested in the Canadian International Development Agency. Now we are going to take a look at Canada's aid as a part of a national income and how this compares to the 0.7% commitment that many other countries have made around the world.
The 0.7% of national income has been agreed upon at multiple international and development conferences. We are going to look at the previous 20 years, and as we can see here, the amount that Canada has allocated to aid was 0.38% in 1995. That amount has since decreased, and as of 2012, we are only contributing 0.32% of our national income to aid. Now comparing this to other countries, the UK, France, Germany, Australia, and Norway are all currently donating more of the national income to aid. Here, Norway is the only country that has reached the 0.7% goal.
After looking at that graph, we can see that not very many countries reach the 0.7% goal. Jeffrey Sachs and Guido Schmidt-Traub, who have both formerly worked for the UN, state that in order to reach the Millennium Development Goals, a 0.7% commitment is needed. One way that Canada has improved their international development efforts is through increasing the quality of aid. 15 years ago, approximately 2/3 of all Canadian development funding was connected to tied aid. Since then, our government has made an effort to reduce this amount, and as of 2012-2013, it is expected that no more of the Canadian government development funding will be connected to tied aid. Canada has also chosen to decrease its countries of focus. This allows it to target more low-income countries, allowing our development efforts to be more effective. However, our Canadian government needs to focus on consistency. As the governments change, they tend to focus on different locations and different projects. If this were to stay the same as the governments change, it would allow our development efforts to be more effective. Other examples showing that Canada is trying to improve on its international development efforts is when it invested in the Micronutrient Initiative, which helped deliver nutritional supplements to hundreds of millions of children around the world. They also invested in the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, which has become one of the most transformative institutions in modern history. They have also made a commitment for helping maternal health and reducing child deaths, which relates to the Millennium Development Goals, and they have increased aid focusing on agricultural and food security through the Global Agricultural and Food Security Program. There are multiple ways that Canada can still improve its international development efforts. For example, the UK has a multi-year conversation which helps the population understand the importance of the 0.7 commitment and how long-term engagement is needed for development. If Canada would begin to implement something similar, this could help increase the amount of aid and understanding for the Millennium Development Goals and their importance for developing countries.
The first graph we are going to look at is aid as a share of national income between Canada and the UK. From this graph, we can see that in the early 1990s, Canada allocated more aid than the UK. Around the year 1999 to 2000, we allocated about the same amount to aid. Since then, the UK has made significant efforts to reach 0.7% of the national income towards aid. Now we are going to look at a graph that shows the frequency that the Millennium Development Goals, or any topics relating to the Millennium Development Goals, were discussed in national newspapers. To make this comparison, the Globe and Mail, which is Canadian national newspaper, was used, and so was the Guardian of London and the Financial Times. As we can see here, the Globe and Mail never published nearly as many articles relating to the Millennium Development Goals as the Guardian or the Financial Times. This may be an example on how Canadians may not be educated on the Millennium Development Goals or their importance. This could also be an example on why there is such a gap between the aid provided by the UK and Canada as we saw in the previous graph.
As we saw from the graph, it could be due to a lack of education and notice, which are preventing Canadians from not knowing that we are not reaching our goals. Studies have shown that Canadians want to do their part in programs and initiatives such as the MDGs. To conclude, Canada needs to make a decision on where we stand in terms of peacekeeping and international development, as this decision will greatly impact the rest of the world. After 2015, the MDGs will come to an end, and Canada will need to make a decision on our goals in terms of international development. Canada is in a position to make a positive change in the world if we choose to do so. Peacekeepers Peacekeepers are constantly needed around the world. The UN and international community would gladly embrace Canada if we chose to become more involved with peacekeeping missions once again. If Canada makes this decision to become more involved with peacekeeping missions, it would allow Canada to gain more influence, and we may be able to regain our seat on the UN Security Council. By increasing our involvement with peacekeeping missions and effort in international development, it would renew pride for Canadians as we could help provide a better, more peaceful world. Thank you.